2701 Pursuit of Mortality. The palace seemed to be on the verge of collapsing by the time Sunny reached its bent, misshapen gates. Actually, he wasn't even sure that the palace could collapse. Normal buildings were built out of brick, wood, or stone. Those in the waking world, meanwhile, were built from cement or metal frames covered by alloy plates. When damaged enough, they crumbled. The palace was simply cast from metal, though. There were no seams on its towering walls, and no distinction between its numerous spires. It was like a titanic organ built from countless hollow pipes. Sunny was not sure what music would be produced if the palace ever sang, and had no idea what its destruction would look like. It was not an idle interest, either. He needed to know in order not to get buried under the debris. Now is not the time to wonder, though. The giant serpent slithered out of the palace like an onyx river and coiled briefly on the open space between its gates and the walls of the dark castle. Then, it vanished, leaving only Nightwalker, his shadow, and Sunny behind. The shadow remained motionless, while Nightwalker rolled across the cracked stones with a stifled curse. Sunny, meanwhile, just stood there for a moment, looking at the silk scroll held in his blackened, charred hand. The rain felt soothing on his skin. A moment later, the scroll disappeared without a trace, transported onto the altar of the replica of the nameless temple standing upon the dark waters of his lightless soul. What the hell is that? Nightwalker was sitting on the ground, staring at his shadow with a strange, mournful expression. It was as if he himself did not understand the bitter feeling of sorrow and longing that the shadow invoked in him, and was confused by that uninvited emotion. Sunny sensed a deep, indescribable longing emanating from the shadow, as well. The two clearly wanted to be mended and become whole again, to become one again. Even if neither of them had the capacity to realize that desire consciously. What a touching reunion. It seemed like a deeply meaningful scene, a man longing to reunite with his death. There was probably some kind of conclusion about human nature to be drawn from it, but Sunny was not really in the mood for philosophical ponderings. His burned body hurt too damn much for that. Lowering his hand, he responded with a shrug. That is your shadow. Sunny approached Nightwalker and added in a subdued tone. Long story short, the Eternal City claimed you by separating you from your shadow. So if we attach it back to your soul, you'll be able to leave. He scrutinized the shadow silently. Of course, you will also become mortal again. Nightwalker looked around. The mountainous edifice of the palace was slowly collapsing in on itself. The entire world seemed to be swallowed by blinding radiance and white flames in the east. A myriad of wraiths was besieging the dwindling formation of the Shadow Legion. A great titan was marching toward them across the lake. And on top of that, the invisible dome holding the obliterating mass of the Stormzy back was on the verge of breaking. Even if one tried really hard, it would be difficult to come up with a worse moment to suddenly become mortal. Nightwalker grinned. Sounds great. Let's do it. There was a profound sense of disbelief hidden behind his carefree tone. It seemed that he had never taken Sunny's promise to help him escape the Eternal City seriously. At least that was how Sunny interpreted a hint of hopelessness reflecting in Nightwalker's silver eyes. He nodded slowly. Can I even do it? Well, that was a meaningless question. Sunny was a supreme, so if he decided to do something, his will would make it happen. His word was law in the most literal sense, as long as he could enforce that law upon the world. Before getting to work, Sunny spent a few moments evaluating the situation on the battlefield. The Shadow Legion was slowly being wiped out, but his expression changed subtly. Cassie, where is Jet? None of his incarnations could sense her presence. The response came shortly. She was swallowed by the soul of Connacht. Sunny's eyes widened. She was what? 4 of his incarnations were supporting the Shadow Legion and were therefore present on the battlefield, but he was not omniscient. The reach of his shadow sense was limited in the Eternal City, and most of the northern expanse of the Palace Island was enveloped by mist now. On top of that, wraiths barely cast shadows. So Sunny was having trouble perceiving the ghostly soldiers and their leader, as well as Jet herself, when she assumed her transcendent form. Which was why he had lost track of her for a bit. What do you mean? She was swallowed by the soul of Connacht. Cassie responded succinctly. I'm sure she'll be fine. It would have been more reassuring if she still had the ability to see the future. Sunny gritted his teeth. It's Jet. It's Master Jet. She knows what she's doing. He was uneasy, but knew that he had to do his own part at the moment. Especially because there was not much time left. The dome of the Eternal City was coming undone, the damn ghost army was on a rampage, and the flesh of Connacht was drawing closer. The whole place was about to collapse. All of these problems could be easily solved, though. All Sunny and his companions had to do was run. While preferable, nothing dictated that they had to slay the flesh, the soul, and the madness of Connacht. Now that Sunny had gotten what he wanted, they could simply leave the three eldritch abominations at the bottom of the Stormsia and escape. The only thing standing in their way was the fate of Nightwalker. As soon as Nightwalker and his shadow were reunited, Sunny would have far more options as far as the end of this expedition was concerned. So, he glanced at the youthful immortal and smiled. Hey, stay still. Nightwalker raised an eyebrow. Okay, but, why did you say it so ominously? Sunny kneeled near him, outstretched a hand, and summoned a memory. Moments later, Weaver's needle fell into his grasp. Because I am going to sew you and your shadow back together. Oh, it might hurt, but don't worry. He smiled pleasantly. You won't die. With that, 4 inky black hands manifested at his sides. The 4 hands wove a thread out of shadow essence. The charred arm hung limply, while the second of the original hands held the needle. Sunny took a deep breath. And got to work. 2702 Shadow Seamster. How had the demon of repose separated living beings from their shadows? Sunny had no idea. That shouldn't have been possible. She was not Shadow God, after all. In all Sunny's years, he had only witnessed something similar once. He had met the lost shadows that belonged to the companions of the First Lord of the Bright Castle at the boundary of the underworld. Sunny still did not know what exactly had happened to them. All he knew was that it had something to do with either nothing or nothing creatures. Come to think about it, there were wisps of nothingness drifting in the central hall of the palace, as well. Perhaps that had something to do with it. In any case, Sunny was uniquely suited to resolve the fate of orphaned shadows, both back then and now. The shadows severed by the demon of repose were being drawn into the shadow realm at the moment. There, they would return to the natural cycle and be reduced to pure essence, which meant that the immortals of the Eternal City would become mortal again. Actually, no, that was not right. They would not become mortal, they would die. All the bodies that comprised the flesh of Connacht would perish. Sunny doubted that it would bring the Great Titan down, though. He did not believe that it cared whether its flesh was dead or alive, after all, it never had. The immortals made for perfect hosts for the malevolent parasite not because they were alive, but because they were undying. Similarly, the flesh of Connacht itself was not going to die. That was because it had never died in the Eternal City, and its shadow was not in the Void Chamber as a result. The sorcery of the Demon of Repose was not holding it back, or rather, the sorcery that had held it back was long gone. The barrier built by Darren did contain it, though. For now, at least, it had been created to prevent a great terror from being unleashed upon the world, not a great titan. In any case, Sunny and his companions would still have to fight the flesh of Connacht. With the sorcery of the Eternal City failing, however, its body would not be healed in an instant, and it would not be raised from the dead, either. So, they at least stood a chance. That was the extent of his current concerns about the shadows drawn into the Shadow Lantern. One shadow remained, though. The shadow of Nightwalker. Unlike the rest, That had to be returned into the embrace of death, that one had to be returned to its original owner instead. But since Sunny did not know what sorcery the Demon of Repose had used to sever it, there was no clear way to reattach it. It was not like he had no relevant experience, though. Surprisingly enough, Sunny had done something similar to what he wanted to achieve once. It was during the creation of the blessing. Back then, he had sewn the shadow of the sword to the shadow of its wielder in order to connect its physical vessel to its spell weave. It had not been easy, considering that he had to bend the world to his will to succeed. However, Sunny had indeed succeeded. Mostly because his will had already been tyrannical enough, but also because he used Weaver's needle and possessed authority over shadows. After all, he was the Lord of Shadows. Sunny had been a transcendent terror back then. He was a supreme titan now, and his will was therefore far more terrifying. So, if he wanted to sew Nightwalker's shadow back to its owner, no one could tell him that it was impossible. It was in his purview to decide what was possible and what was not, to begin with. I doubt it will be effortless, though. Laying the shadow of Nightwalker over the inanimate shadow that followed him around, Sunny peered into his soul and saw the splendid radiance of his star-like core. Then, he reached forward and pierced Nightwalker's soul with his needle. Nightwalker gritted his teeth, then let out a curse so dirty and inventive that Sunny almost blushed. What the hell? I did not know those words went together. Settle down, it's just the first stitch. There was far more coming. Nightwalker glared at him silently. Then get on with it. Smiling faintly, Sunny did. While one of his avatars was busy reattaching an orphaned shadow to its other half, 4 incarnations of Sunny were supporting the Shadow Legion in its desperate battle against the Wraith army. To be honest, I am a bit disappointed. Sunny had hoped that his legion would be able to repel the myriad of souls unleashed by the Dutchman. However, the actual outcome was somewhat expected. After all, the captain of the Dutchman had spent thousands of years accumulating his forces. Sunny, meanwhile, was not even 30 yet. What will I become in a few thousand years, I wonder? How vast will my legion be? Well, by then, he would not be the sovereign of death anymore. He would simply be death. So, his legion would presumably consist of everyone who had ever died. If he were to survive at all, naturally. The situation is troubling. The number of shades was dwindling. His shadows were wounded. The formation of the Shadow Legion was pressed against the walls of the Dark Castle, barely wide enough to defend it. Nephis was still fighting the madness of Connacht, but Jet was nowhere to be seen, which meant the Cursed Wanderer was free to wreak havoc. However, Sunny had just a plan in mind to turn the situation around. It required him to make a little sacrifice, but promised a bountiful harvest in return. No sense in wasting time, then. A second later, 3 of his incarnations abandoned the Shadow Legion, leaving only the one augmenting the puppeteer behind. Robbed of their support and of the dire boon granted by the curse, the Silent Shades suffered. More of them were being killed now under the onslaught of wraiths, and fewer enemies were vanquished. The inevitable defeat of the Shadow Legion was brought closer. But that was, hopefully, all right. The 3 incarnations manifested black wings and soared into the air. They were flying toward the palace, whose walls were torn and split open by then. A few moments later, the incarnations dove into one of the rifts and disappeared from view. 2703 Last hurdle. The Shadow Legion had been pushed against the walls of the Dark Castle and diminished to barely a third of its size. The mist that threatened to swallow it had been held back by an appalling blizzard for a while, but now that the shadow of the Winter Beast was vanquished, it enveloped the world, the defiled Seeker had fallen, and even the elusive Ember Queen was littered with grievous wounds. Neither the Shades nor the Wraiths left bodies behind, and the Palace Island kept repairing itself no matter how terribly it was shattered and broken, but the battle that was taking place on its shores had been truly cataclysmic, more so than any battle Sunny had ever participated in. And he was losing that battle. His legion had been at a disadvantage to begin with, and that disadvantage continued to grow exponentially as more and more shades were vanquished. Things took a truly drastic turn only when he pulled back 3 of his incarnations, though. Devoid of their support, the formation of the Shadow Legion started to melt at a dire speed. But even that was not the most pressing issue. That bastard. The most pressing issue was the Cursed Wanderer and the eerie sword he wielded, the great tyrant, Soul of Connacht. Before the flesh of Connacht arrived, that was. Now that Jet was gone, there was no one left to stand in his way, which meant that he could utterly decimate the formation of the Shiseido Legion. Worse still, the sinister apparition did not simply vanquish the Shades, he could truly destroy them. Sunny could not allow that to happen. The problem was that he did not have a lot of options left. The Shadow Legion was already barely holding on, or failing to hold on, rather, and very few of his warriors could slow down the Cursed Wanderer, let alone contend against him. Sunny could command Saint to bar his path, for example, but that would only cause the section of the formation she was supporting to collapse. What to do? Did he have to face the Great Wraith personally? Only 2 of his incarnations were outside the palace. One was busy attaching Nightwalker to his wayward shadow, while the other was augmenting the puppeteer. Sunny could potentially abandon the gigantic moth and manifest himself onto the battlefield, but that would mean surrendering precise control of the Shadow Legion. The result would be just as disastrous as doing nothing. I just need to buy time. He considered his options feverishly, trying to determine the optimal solution, then rapidly settled on the best one. Down on the battlefield, the Cursed Wanderer picked up the ghostly cutlass from the ground and straightened slowly. He cast an aloof gaze at the crumbling formation of the Shadow Legion, and then headed toward it with unhurried steps. An obsidian wasp dove at him through the pouring rain, and he casually bisected it with an effortless slash. His gaze climbed higher, finally settling on the dark figure of the colossal moth perched atop the highest tower of the magnificent Black Castle. The Cursed Wanderer regarded it for a moment, and then his cold sea-colored eyes ignited with a dreadful malice. The sinister apparition continued forward, casually slaughtering the shades that tried to get in his way. Until a lightning-quick blade strike from the veil of rain, sudden and entirely unseen. The Cursed Wanderer only reacted at the very last moment, rapidly raising his cutlass to block it. The impact actually pushed him several meters back, and the ground behind him was shattered in a long and jagged line. He remained motionless for a moment, then righted his posture and glanced ahead. There, hidden in the rain and swirling mist, a dark figure stood, staring back at him with a ruthless intensity. Her ebony body was encased in a suit of light armor, and her face was obscured by a veil. She wielded a short sword in one of her hands, and as the sinister apparition watched, she unsheathed another. Both blades slowly swelled with a blinding glow, illuminating the mist and outlining her slender figure. She was the shadow of Orphne of the Nine, Slayer. Sunny had commanded her to abandon the walls of the dark castle and descend onto the battlefield. Who was better suited to confront the ghost of a fallen member of the Nine, after all? The ghostly face of the cursed wanderer remained motionless, but something changed in the depths of his sea-colored eyes. A hint of recognition appeared in them, painted by an inexplicable emotion. His lips, which had remained sealed for thousands of years, moved slowly, as if straining to whisper a forgotten name. But in the end, no sound came from them. Indifferent to the subtle movement, Slayer lunged forward with harrowing speed. A trail of shattered raindrops was left in her wake, and the mist flowed in a turbulent stream around her. The cursed wanderer shifted and met her attack with indomitable strength, causing a flash of light to drown everything around. The shining swords and the ghostly cutlass danced a lethal dance, guided by my malevolent will and boundless killing intent. The litany of ringing steel echoed in the mist, fusing into a dreadful melody. The shadow and the wraith exchanged 100 blows in the blink of an eye, shattering the ground around them completely. Slayer did not manage to gain the upper hand. In fact, she was pushed back a few steps and forced into a defensive stance. However, she had not been defeated, either. For a few seconds, at least, the dangerous clash seemed to hang in fragile balance. Which meant that the cursed wanderer was temporarily contained and held back from reaching the formation of the Shadow Legion. And that was all Sunny needed. Because by the time Slayer could not hold the sinister apparition back anymore, he would have had enough time to turn this entire battle upside down. 2704 Turning the Tide. Slayer engaged the cursed wanderer in a lethal duel, which bought the Shadow Legion some time. But, sadly, not a lot of time. Even if she continued to hold the sinister apparition back, his army of wraiths was still assaulting the weakening formation. Of the Silent Shades, Saint, Fiend, and Serpent did their best to repel the enemy, but even their great strength was not enough to turn the tide of the battle. Soon enough, the formation was going to break. The wraiths were going to wash over scattered shades, obliterating them. Then, they would assault the walls of the Dark Castle, bring them down, and slaughter its defenders. Lastly, Sunny would be left to face the horrors of the Eternal City alone, having lost both his shades and his shadows. He would probably be able to save Knave, but the incarnation sewing Nightwalker and his shadow together would be interrupted, dooming the legendary founder of the House of Night. That was unless the flesh of Connacht reached the Palace Island first and fused with the soul of Connacht, dooming all of them. The ghastly mountain of bleeding flesh was already looming close, wading through the boiling lake with deceptively slow steps. Now that it was closer, its titanic size felt especially daunting. The flesh of Connacht was not exactly on the same level as Condemnation, but close to it, standing as tall as the palace. Actually, now that the palace was collapsing, it was taller than it. The abhorrent titan could easily reach the roof of the failing dome with its hand, which meant that it could reach the Ivory Island, as well. It could also tear off the enormous wings of the puppeteer or crush the entirety of the Dark Castle under one foot. How are we even supposed to fight that thing? Sunny knew that he would manage, somehow, if push came to shove. But he was not looking forward to that particular battle. He would have to survive the Dutchman and the Wraith Horde first to get the chance to survive against the flesh of Connacht, though. East of the Palace Island, Nephis and the madness of Connacht were still locked in a furious battle. Sunny did not know what was going on there, but judging by the blinding radiance that enveloped the eastern sky, she was going all out. The situation seemed hopeless, but, luckily, it was not. Continuing to stitch Nightwalker and his shadow together, Sunny smiled darkly. Good job, Slayer. He had bought himself enough time. Out there on the shattered battlefield in front of the Dark Castle, the formation of the Shadow Legion shifted faintly. The towering gates of the castle opened. And then, suddenly, rows of new shades marched out of its maw. Hundreds of them at first, then thousands. Most belonged to humans, but some belonged to magnificent beasts. And all of them were exceedingly powerful. Sunny's smile widened. Well, naturally they were. After all, they were the shadows of the immortals of the Eternal City. At the same time as his burned incarnation had begun to stitch the orphaned shadow to Nightwalker, the rest entered the collapsing palace. In an ironic twist of fate, or lack thereof, he rushed back to the Shadow Lantern immediately after escaping it. His avatars rapidly reached the Void Chamber, what had been the Void Chamber, rather. It did not exist anymore, having fused with the Great Hall above it in a mess of darkness and torn metal. The dying star was barely an ember, and the black rift of the Gate of Shadows seemed to have grown hungrily in size. The three Incarnations dove into its impenetrable darkness without ever slowing down. Arg! Entering the Shadow Realm, Sunny was immediately blinded. The vast expanse of black dunes was usually shrouded in darkness, illuminated only by the distant radiance of the essence storms. However, at the moment, he was surrounded by turbulent currents of essence on all sides, bathed in luminous light. It seemed that an essence storm was being born at that precise moment, in front of his eyes, all around him. Countless shadows were moving slowly in the blinding radiance, slowly dissolving into billowing torrents of essence. They were the shadows he had liberated from the prison built by the Demon of Repose, delivered to the realm of death after eons of captivity. The Shadow Realm was rending the shadows rapidly, as if time was catching up to them. He was not going to be able to recruit them all, but with 3 avatars acting as his heralds, he would be able to recruit numerous. Enough to turn the flood of the battle, at least. And that was what he did. Now, thousands of immensely powerful shades emerged from the gates of the dark cast like a black torrent. They flowed around the formation of the Shadow Legion and descended upon the wraiths from the flanks, crashing into them like an obliterating wave. Compared to the myriad of ghostly soldiers, there were not that many new shades joining the battle. But each of them had been cast by an immortal dweller of the Eternal City. They were all tremendously strong, vastly increasing the power of the diminished Shadow Legion. Enough so to break the balance of the battle entirely. The Shadow Legion had been losing before. But now, it suddenly had the advantage, pushing the ethereal warriors back. Countless wraiths were slaughtered in an instant, and more were being destroyed every moment. Even the mist seemed to reel back, repelled by the fury of the calamitous clash. Somewhere above, there was the sound of thunder. A hexagonal section of the invisible dome failed, and a pillar of black water of the same form crashed down, instantly turning the ruins below into dust. The dust did not move anymore, having lost its ability to turn back into magnificent buildings. The cursed wanderer halted for a moment, watching as his army was being destroyed. Then, he lunged forward, broke through Slayer's defense with a reckless attack, and endured the sharp bite of her blades. He was severely wounded, but managed to push Slayer back with that sacrifice. She evaded the ghostly cutlass, but failed to evade his empty hand. The great wraith's hand pierced her abdomen, dealing her a deep wound, and threw her to the ground dozens of meters away. The cursed wanderer did not pursue his wounded opponent, though. He did not rush to join his melting army, either. Instead, the sinister apparition turned around and rushed toward the approaching ghastly mass of the flesh of Connacht. Sunny flinched. Curses. 2705 Soul of Connacht. Damnation. Behind Sunny, the palace collapsed inward with a deafening scream of ripping metal. Its proud spires and towering walls crumpled as if they were made from paper, and its foundation actually detached from the ground in a mess of jagged edges, slowly rising into the air. The entire huge structure seemed to levitate. In reality, of course, it wasn't taking flight, it was simply being drawn to a central point. The expanse of the palace above the void chamber was being drawn downward, while everything below it was being drawn upward. The unimaginable mass of metal was contracting under inconceivable pressure, deforming and losing shape as it slowly grew smaller. The invisible dome protecting the Eternal was in the initial stages of collapsing, as well, and the flesh of Connacht was just a few steps away from reaching the shore of the palace island. But that was not what had Sunny's attention at the moment. Instead, it was the cursed wanderer, who had chosen to abandon his wraith army and dash toward the lumbering great titan instead of continuing his assault. That damn wretch. Belatedly, Sunny realized that just like he and his companions had already accomplished most of their goals, the sinister apparition had already accomplished his. Since they could simply retreat, so could he. It was just that nightmare creatures were not usually ones to resist the scent of human souls, so Sunny had not considered this turn of events seriously. But the cursed wanderer had already gotten his main praise, the remains of the heart of Connacht, which were preserved in Jet. Now that Jet was in his grasp, obliterating the Shadow Legion was merely a bonus. And it seemed like the Great Wraith chose to continue expanding his collection of the fragments of Connacht first, then slaughter the humans second. Curse him. It was a reasonable choice. The problem was that Sunny could hardly pursue the apparition at the moment. Slayer was wounded and far behind the cursed wanderer, so even if she ignored her wounds and pursued, she would not be able to catch up with him in time. Saint was even further away, while Serpent and Fiend were entangled with a vast swarm of wraiths. Neither Knave nor the shadow of Darren were swift enough, and even the puppeteer was not going to reach the sinister apparition in time. Sunny could only go himself, but if he did, the Shadow Legion would lose its hard-won advantage and fall into a dire state again. The flesh of Connacht was like a mountain now, having drawn close enough for its titanic body to be beheld in all its abhorrent glory. The boiling waters of the lake barely reached its knees, and as it took the next step, the entire palace island trembled. By now, it could touch the shore by simply leaning down and outstretching a hand. And that was where the cursed wanderer was rushing, to the span of the lake shore directly in front of the great titan. He was raising his ethereal cutlass, as if prepared to sink it into the titan's flesh. His cold, sea-colored eyes were glowing with an ominous light. Sunny attempted to manifest shadows to bar the sinister apparition's path, but his adversary was too far, seconds away from reaching the shore. Crap, Sunny steeled himself for things going from bad to worse. But then, something strange happened. The ethereal glow of the Viridian cutlass suddenly grew dimmer. And then, it grew dimmer still. Come to think of it, Sunny suddenly realized that it had not emanated a wave of Viridian radiance, and therefore had not summoned a new swarm of wraiths, in a while. The cursed wanderer had felt that something was wrong, as well. Without ever slowing down, he spun and threw the ghostly cutlass, which cut through the raging currents of rain like a flash of Viridian lightning. The spinning blade soared high, aimed at the heart of the flesh of Connacht. Sunny did know what would have happened if the two parts of Connacht collided, and he never got the chance to find out. Because the ethereal cutlass never reached the titan. Almost immediately after it left its master's hand, a net of thin cracks spread across its Viridian blade. And then, to Sunny's shock, and the cursed wanderer's shock, as well, it shattered. Even the flesh of Connacht seemed stunned by the sudden destruction, halting for a moment as it reached the shallows of the lake. However, there was no mistake. The ghostly cutlass wielded by the sinister apparition broke apart as it flew, its shards falling down as they slowly dissolved into ethereal light. The soul of Connacht had been destroyed. Sunny perceived its destruction viscerally, sensing its faint, but distressing shadow dissipate without a trace. How? He struggled to believe his own senses. The mist swirled as it swallowed the last glimmers of the eldritch horror. Then, the mist coalesced into a familiar form. Jet stood there, in front of the cursed wanderer, wielding a fearsome scythe. She was still in her wraith form, looking dreadfully similar to Undying Slaughter, by whose hand Sunny had died gruesomely many times. There was something different about her. Jet had not grown taller, but her presence had become far more overwhelming, making it seem like she did. It was as if she towered above the cursed wanderer now, looking down at him with her icy blue eyes. The cursed wanderer glanced at her, as well. Then, the harrowing scythe fell down, passing through his ghostly body from shoulder to hip. He remained motionless for a few seconds, frozen in place. But a moment later, a gust of dreadful wind blew and dispelled him like mist. Just like that, the cursed wanderer was destroyed, as well. He was vanquished in the very heart of the Eternal City, which he had searched for thousands of years, slain by a far more harrowing wraith. Jet lowered her scythe and glanced up, as if wanting to inhale deeply. At that moment, Cassie's voice resounded in Sunny's head. "See, I told you she'll be fine. 2706 Fox in the henhouse. You have slain a great tyrant, soul of Connacht. You have slain a corrupted devil, Alates of the Nine." Jet glanced up at the dark sky of the Eternal City. She should have felt ecstatic, but instead, the thought that came to mind was, damn, she had not been away for long, but the sky above her was crumbling. The torrential rain had turned into an apocalyptic downpour, and here and there, colossal hexagonal pillars towered above the ruined city. From afar, it seemed as if they were supporting the invisible dome of the sky, but it did not take Jet more than a moment to realize what they really were. The vast surface of the invisible dome turned out to be composed of countless hexagons, and as some of them faded out of existence, the cold waters of the Stormzea rushed down under devastating pressure. The giant pillars were not supporting the dome, they were water falling through the breaches in the dome, still contained in their shape. On top of that, the palace was nowhere to be seen. Instead of it, a gargantuan mass of bent metal was floating in the air, groaning as it was being bent even further. By the dead gods, I only stepped out for a moment. On the positive side, the Shadow Legion seemed to have been pushing the Wraiths back. And now that both the Tyrant controlling them and the Devil controlling the Tyrant were gone, those Wraiths were barely a threat. They would be wiped out before too long. Right, Jet finally remembered what she had done. She had killed them. The soul of Connacht, the cursed wanderer. The horror of the seas, Dutchman, and its fearsome captain were both gone, slain by her hand like many abominations before them. Jet had killed countless nightmare creatures throughout the years, but still. This was her crowning achievement. A saint killing a great tyrant was not exactly a common occurrence. In fact, it was something that was not RE supposed to happen. And yet, Jet had done it. In the end, it had all come down to the decision she made after activating the special ability granted to the Mist Blade by the soul of the Heart of Connacht. Jet had wanted to attempt killing the Cursed Wanderer, but she was not sure if she would be able to. It was a gamble, and a perilous one at that. So, in the end, she went with a different gamble. Instead of trying to slay the master of the soul of Connacht, he chose to be swallowed by it. It was not an entirely reckless decision. Jet had been studying the Dutchman and its wraiths for a while by then. She had especially noted that the ghostly cutlass kept emanating torrents of ethereal light, summoning more spectral warriors onto the battlefield, which meant that its hold was not empty yet. The soul of Connacht was a hungry beast that had devoured countless souls throughout the ages. However, Jet had quite an appetite herself. She wanted to kill the cursed wanderer, but that was not her task. Her task was to hold him back and buy her allies enough time to accomplish their goals. The soul of Connacht was his source of power, so if she could destroy or weaken it, that would achieve the same result. Plus, she had just the needed constitution to do that, being a wraith and all. So instead of trying to kill the cursed wanderer in the single heartbeat granted to her by the Heart of Connacht, Jet severed his hand and took hold of the ghostly cutlass instead. She knew that it would consume her. In fact, the very purpose of stealing the soul of Connacht was to be consumed by it. Still, when she felt herself being drawn into the Viridian blade, she could not help but feel unnerved and cursed quietly. In the next moment, she was gone. Out there in the belly of the soul of Connacht, the world was different. There was no world there, actually, to begin with. There was no space, no time, no life, no death. Just a vague expanse of Viridian glow that enveloped her like a mire. And the presence of many souls that the tyrant had consumed, just like her. But there was one crucial difference between Jet and those subjugated souls. They had been killed before becoming thralls of the soul of Connacht. Jet, however, had been dead to begin with. She entered captivity as a malevolent wraith, not as a hapless soul stripped of its flesh. And that allowed Jet a measure of independence, at least for a brief moment. She was on the verge of dying by then, her soul almost entirely drained of essence. The tyrannical will of the soul of Connacht descended upon her, striving to suffocate her sense of self and make her a mindless, obedient thrall. It might have succeeded, as well, it would have, probably, given a chance. But Jet did not give the soul of Connacht an opportunity to conquer her. Instead, she used that brief moment to raise the mist blade and focused her killing intent into a razor-sharp scythe. One slash of that scythe was enough to harvest every enthralled soul within the great tyrant. After all, there was no space and no time there. That meant that all of the captured souls occupied the same space, and unleashing 10,000 strikes took the same amount of time as striking once. So, like a fox in the henhouse, Soul Reaper Jet slaughtered every single phantom contained within the soul of Connacht in an instant. A tsunami of essence flooded her crumbling soul, mending it in an instant. Much more impactful was the great torrent of fragments that flowed into her shattered soul core. The core, which had been growing steadily for decades, suddenly ballooned, increasing in size at a speed visible to the naked eye. It had instantly grown so vast and so heavy, in fact, that Jet's transcendent soul started to struggle with bearing its weight. That's quite a boon. I think. Jet felt strange, much more powerful, yes, but also, dangerously unbalanced. She would deal with that later, though. For now, Jet had slaughtered every soul enveloped by the Viridian glow with her first strike. Her second strike was aimed at the walls of her prison itself. It was as if she were cutting a way through the belly of a beast after being swallowed by it. Soon enough, the strange unworld surrounding her shattered, and she found herself under the tempestuous sky of the Eternal City once again. Standing in front of the cursed wanderer. The sinister wraith seemed greatly diminished now that the source of his power was destroyed. Jet, meanwhile, felt more powerful than ever. So, she brought her scythe down and erased her adversary from existence. That was how the dreadful legend of the cursed wanderer and his appalling ship ended. That was how a new chapter was added to the glorious legend of the Soul Reaper jet, as well. 2707 Finish line. The battle against the Dutchman and his Wraith Armada was all but over. It ended suddenly and without warning when Jet shattered the soul of Connacht from within and cut its master down with her mist blade. At the moment, surrounded by cold mist in her ghostly form, she really did look like the Grim Reaper. Continuing to pour all of his will into stitching Nightwalker and his shadow back together, Sunny whistled quietly. She really is fine. Honestly, it felt great. For once, someone else had pulled off an unexpected and utterly unbelievable, borderline preposterous feat. Sunny was quite happy to be usurped. This peculiar mixture of disbelief and elation, is that how people feel when I'm around? Maybe it was. What are you mumbling about? Sunny was pale and covered in cold sweat because of his ghastly burns and the exertion of bending the world to his will, while Nightwalker looked the same because his soul was being pierced by a literal needle. His voice sounded a bit strained. Sunny flashed him a brief smile. It's Jet. She killed the Dutchman. Nightwalker blinked a few times. That lovely young lady. She destroyed that fiend. Sunny chuckled. Yes. To everyone outside the Eternal City, that lovely young lady is the fiend. She had once been the commanding officer of the Devil, after all. Sunny sounded nonchalant, but while he wasn't as stunned as Nightwalker, he was also surprised. Jet was strong, yes, but the most powerful adversary she had defeated before was a great devil, and even then, Effie and Kai had aided her. So, he had not expected her to go and outright slay the Dutchman. She had given them an unexpected gift. There were countless wraiths still left on the battlefield, but now that the tyrant who commanded them was gone, they became a disorganized mob. The Shadow Legion had already been gaining the upper hand, so now the battle was turning into a slaughter. The sorcery of the Demon of Repose was failing, and as more holes appeared on the surface of the dome, the ruins below were not repairing themselves anymore. The crushing had destroyed the Eternal City one final time. Behind Sunny, the palace was slowly turning into an enormous sphere of jagged scrap metal. Beyond the palace, oh, damn, the entire eastern expanse of the lake was enveloped in white flames and swirling torrents of black dust. Nephis seemed to have unleashed her true transcendent form, becoming a boundless sea of immolating fire. The maelstrom of flame and dust was revolving furiously, being drawn to the center of the fiery calamity. Soon, it coalesced into a radiant silhouette that hovered alone above the water, illuminating the darkness with her luminosity. Nephis seemed to have absorbed the madness of Connacht into herself. That was one way to deal with the seemingly indestructible nightmare creature. Just her style. She remained motionless for a few moments, then lowered her head slowly and briefly covered her eyes with an unsteady hand. Then, her eyes ignited with a pristine, ferocious white light. Sunny thought that he heard an echo of an inhuman wail. I guess that one is dead, as well. Ah, I suddenly feel lazy. Sunny was not entirely sure how Nephis had managed to absorb the madness of Connacht into her mind and burn it to ashes instead of succumbing to it, but then again, that sounded exactly like something she would do. If it had been Sunny, he would have probably had to suffer infuriating whispers for a couple of years before finding a way to rid himself of the maddening mind invader. What are you talking about now? Nightwalker glanced at him with curiosity. Sunny smiled. Oh, Nephis killed the madness of Connacht. Nightwalker tilted his head. Nephis, that pretty young lady. Sunny gave him a smoldering glare. Yes, and hey, bastard, pretty young lady again. Don't you know any other words? Nightwalker smiled sheepishly. What? I'm just saying it like it is. He paused for a moment, then asked with a hint of excitement in his voice. What about Knave? Whom did he kill? Sunny stared at him with a dubious expression. A bunch of wraiths. Nightwalker remained silent for a bit, then glanced away and sighed. Well, he did his best. Sunny frowned and drove Weaver's needle into his soul. Ouch. At that moment, Sunny dismissed the shadow lantern. The last of the shadows had just entered the Gate of Shadow, so there was no need to keep it manifested anymore. Sunny had recruited as many as he could, and the rest were already being obliterated by the Shadow Realm. A resulting essence storm was becoming increasingly devastating and ferocious, accelerating their final demise. Even Sunny's own avatars were not safe there anymore. So, raising a hand, he summoned the shadow lantern back. The small stone lantern appeared in his hand as if nothing had happened, as if it had not randomly turned into a black hole and obliterated both the divine sorcery of the Demon of Repose and her entire palace. Its gate opened, and 3 tattered shadows flowed out of it, turning into 3 battered avatars of Sunny. Welcome back, guys. Good job. Behind them, the messy sphere of metal that had been levitating high above the island suddenly plummeted down and hit the ground with a deafening thunderclap. It was all that remained of the palace, 100 times smaller in diameter, but weighing the same. The moment the sphere impacted against the ground, the palace island shook, and its surface split open. Shielding his eyes from the cloud of dust and debris that rose into the air, Sunny calmly continued stitching. Nightwalker, meanwhile, glanced north, where a titanic mountain of ghastly flesh was drawing closer to the shore. The arrival of the flesh of Connacht was imminent, and the shadow was attached only halfway. So, only this ugly thing is left, then. Sunny took a deep breath. Yeah, why worry, though, it's just a great titan. 2708 enemy titan. Sunny would be a fool not to be wary of a great titan, especially one as ominous as the flesh of Connacht. True, he had slain a cursed tyrant once, a being who was far more powerful, at least in theory. However, that had happened inside Ariel's game, where the puppeteer had been heavily restricted by the rules of the miniature realm. Its greatest power was the beings it controlled, but in the end, the sinister moth had been forced to face Sunny alone in melee combat. So, now, its shadow helped him control his legion. The flesh of Connacht was not restricted by anything, though, and could unleash its power fully. Still, while Sunny was worried, he wasn't too worried. Facing the great titan alone might have been tough, but at the moment, there were two supreme titans set against it, the Lord of Shadows and the Star of Ruin. Speaking of ruin, Nephis had thoroughly destroyed the Eternal City with the help of the Crushing. Sunny had unraveled the sorcery sustaining it, while she obliterated the city itself. Now, it was slowly being turned to dust by the growing number of hexagonal pillars of water, and only the area around the palace island still remained unscathed. Well, relatively unscathed. The palace itself was gone, and the entire island had cracked. The Shadow Legion was still cleaning up the remaining wraiths, exacerbating the damage. What wondrous destruction! The Eternal City had survived thousands of years, but Sunny and Nephis wrecked it in the span of a day. Now, all they had to do was destroy the flesh of Connacht, as well, or at least stall it long enough for him to make Nightwalker mortal again. Sunny considered his options carefully while his avatars moved to the northern shore of the island. He abandoned the puppeteer, as well, judging that the Shadow Legion could finish the job even without his direct participation, so, 4 of his avatars stepped out of the shadows near Jet. She was still in her wraith form, looking calmly at the Elo-oming titan. Letting his avatars fuse into one, Sunny spent a second enjoying the rush of power and raised an eyebrow. Why are you not turning back into a human? Her ghostly eyes pierced him with a distant gaze. Jet remained silent for a while, then shrugged. Oh, somehow, this felt more natural for a moment. The mist around them flowed, being absorbed into her ethereal form and her scythe. Then, she turned back into a human and forced out a smile. Damn, I look like a corpse. Her armor was torn, and her face was bloodied. Having endured the duel against the cursed wanderer, Jet looked quite battered, although, surprisingly, not as battered as Slayer was. That was the difference between fighting an enemy that you perfectly countered and one that you did not. Sunny stared at her for a moment, then said neutrally, "You are a corpse." Jet grinned. "At least I have a corpse, though. You're just a creepy shadow." Sunny could not help but smile back. "Excuse me, creepy. I am not just a creepy shadow. I'm also 6 other shadows." He fell silent for a few seconds, then added earnestly, "Also, good job killing the Dutchman." Jet nodded. "Good job destroying the palace. You should think about opening a demolition company." With that, she turned and looked back at the flesh of Connacht. She remained silent for a moment, then asked, "So, what now?" "I sort of gained a lot from slaying that dreadful duo. Essence, a deluge of fragments, and their souls are trapped in the Mist Blade now, as well. However, as much as I hate to admit it, I don't think I am ready to fight another damn part of Connacht." Sunny shook his head. "That's all right. You should head back and help Cassie and Nave finish off the remnants of the Wraith Armada. We'll take it from here." He paused to think for a second, and then added, "Oh, and since this whole place seems to be falling apart, be ready to board the chain breaker and get the hell out of here, Great Titan be damned." Jet chuckled. "I guess our expedition is really coming to an end then." She looked at the scene of devastation around them, then sighed and turned her back to the lake. "It was fun, but also, let's do something less exciting next time." Sunny wasn't sure that he could promise something like that in good faith, but still nodded. "Deal. Actually, I've been thinking about exploring the underworld." But Jet was already rushing away. Nope, not a chance. Take Cassie instead. She hasn't had an astonishing adventure with the Lord of Shadows yet. With that, she was gone. However, Sunny was not alone on the fractured shore. At some point during their conversation, Nepes had landed on the stones behind them, her silver hair moving faintly in the wind. Now, she walked over to stand beside Sunny on the edge of the water, and both of them looked at the approaching Titan. Why did she run away? What did you say? Sunny coughed. I just shared my plans. You know, one last expedition. She remained silent for a moment. I see. Her voice should have been flat and devoid of emotion, somewhat, but it sounded strangely full of it instead. Sunny studied her carefully, feeling that something about his girlfriend had changed. The madness of Connacht. I assume it's dead. Nepes shrugged slightly. It's dying. Having it in my head was fruitful. I think I took a big step toward mastering the knowledge of corruption. Sunny smiled faintly. That's good. He fell silent, then asked in the same tone. So, how are we going to handle this great Titan? Nepes looked up at the immense expanse of the walking, abhorrent mountain of grotesque flesh and said with a hint of hesitation in her voice. I go high, you go low. Sunny studied her for a moment. Was that a comment about my height? Nepes finally turned away from the Titan and looked at him silently. I love your height. Sunny coughed again. Oh, that's good, then. As Nepes took a step forward, though, his expression changed subtly. Wait, hey, you didn't say no. 2709 in the flesh. Neff's skin swelled with a blinding radiance, and two gorgeous wings opened behind her. She soared into the crumbling sky of the Eternal City, rising to meet the titanic figure of the abhorrent Great Titan. It was as if a falling star was shooting from the ground to pierce its gigantic head, surrounded by a vast halo of pure light. Light and darkness clashed, and darkness parted to make way. Illuminated by the passing of the Star of Ruin, countless raindrops glistened like precious jewels. At the same time, a tide of shadows swallowed Sunny and surged, transforming into the Shadow Colossus. Jade Mantle encased him in a suit of fearsome black armor. He summoned Serpent, who turned into a tenebrous Odachi that spanned no less than 200 meters. Dare I say that my height is of no issue? Sunny smiled. His shell was truly enormous, but it seemed tiny in front of the monstrous figure of the flesh of Connacht, barely reaching its knee. He could make it taller, but the amount of effort needed to maintain such an immense manifestation would grow exponentially, especially considering how intricate a proper shell needed to be. So while this size was not his limit, it was the optimal choice. Let's fight a Titan. Sunny took a step forward. At the same time, he activated the weakening curse enchantment of the curse, with 4 links of his shadowbound memory working in tandem to rob the flesh of Connacht of its strength. The effect was both potent and instant, making the great Titan stagger a little as it rose from the lake. Nepes had almost reached it by then. However, instead of attacking straight away, she circled the titanic nightmare creature, as if aiming to attack it from behind. Although Titans were enormous, they were also relatively slow, or at least were supposed to be due to their unimaginable size. Nepes, on the contrary, was impossibly fast, so trying to circle the foe seemed like a good tactic. However, in reality, the flesh of Connacht did not seem to care about where the attack came from. Its misshapen figure resembled a human, but did not behave like a human. As soon as Nepes drew close to the back of its head, countless tendrils of bleeding flesh shot from its shoulders like a slithering forest, threatening to pierce, envelop, and suffocate her. But that was all right. Delivering a powerful blow was not the main purpose of her maneuver. Anyway, the real purpose was simply to get behind the flesh of Connacht. Because now that Nepes was behind it, her blinding radiance cast the Titan's shadow onto the palace island. And there, Sunny reversed the grip on the hilt of his lethal Odachi, then plunged it into that shadow to the hilt. At the same time, the name of Connacht thundered from the crumbling sky as Nepes called fire and destruction upon the great Titan. Flying back from the forest of red tendrils, she brandished the blessing and unleashed an enormous plume of flame from its blade. It was as if her sword suddenly extended to be hundreds of meters long, cutting cleanly through the creature's neck. The flesh of Connacht had been weakened. Then, Nepes and Sunny delivered simultaneous blows. Sunny targeted its soul, while Nepes targeted its corporeal vessel. The great Titan shuddered. Its head started to fall, a charred chasm opening across its vast neck. However, a moment later, countless ropes of flesh shot from the awful wound, breaching the chasm. They connected the head back to the neck, then tensed, pulling the severed parts back together. A moment later, the ghastly cut disappeared entirely, as if it had never existed at all. The soul of the ghastly nightmare creature did not seem severely damaged, either, or possibly it had repaired itself in the blink of an eye, just like the body did. Sunny grimaced. This is going to be bad. A heartbeat later, the flesh of Connacht retaliated. Moving with surprising speed, it leaned forward and slammed its ghastly fist into the ground, only missing Sunny by a hair's breadth due to his rapid reaction. The entire island shuddered, the fractures scarring its surface growing wider. At the same time, two more immense arms suddenly shot from its back in a torrent of blood, aiming to catch Neffy's. The lake receded, then rushed back in a towering wave. That was. Sunny was no more than 100 meters away from the arm of the great titan, the enormous fist resting in a small crater, well within the striking distance of his Odachi. He was already in the proper stance as well, so it would take him only a heartbeat to unleash a devastating slash. Close. However, before Sunny could pat himself on the shoulder for skirting the obliterating blow, the flesh of the immense forearm squirmed, and countless tendrils shot from it toward him. This time, there was no time to evade them. High above, Neffy's had become a radiant spirit. A powerful explosion rippled from his shining figure, tearing the two hands closing in on her to shreds. But instead of being destroyed, new hands grew from the bleeding stumps, reaching toward her again. At the same time, Sunny was enveloped by the red tendrils. They slithered across his armor, penetrating the seams between its parts. Two pierced the visor of his helmet, burrowing into the eyes of the Shadow Colossus shell. The damage they dealt was not really severe. But something eerie happened then. The flesh of the great titan did not simply stop at damaging the shell. Instead, it grew, spreading through the shell like countless tumors. The shell, built in the image of a human body, became infected, compromised, and then transformed by the invading sickness. Damnation! Sunny barely had time to escape his own shell. Appearing out of the shadows hundreds of meters away, he threw a stunned look at the towering Shadow Colossus. If it could be called that, still. Enveloped and penetrated by the bleeding flesh, it looked no different from the titanic nightmare creature behind it. It had been infected by the flesh of Connacht, it had become the flesh of Connacht. The red colossus shuddered, then took a step forward. Then, another. Then, it collided with the forearm of the great titan and was absorbed into it, becoming a part of the ghastly creature. Standing on the shattered ground of the palace island, Sunny shivered. I can't feel those shadows anymore. Only Serpent managed to escape, assuming his soul beast form and slithering away. Sunny's shell was truly and utterly gone. 2710 growing threat. Even weakened, the flesh of Connacht was fearsome. It was enormous. Its power was like a natural calamity. Its vitality seemed boundless, and its will was like a vast ocean, reshaping the world around the great titan to excuse its existence. Worse than that, its grotesque body was infinitely malleable, mutating at a startling speed to answer the demands of combat. That made the monstrous nightmare creature utterly unpredictable, and therefore countless times more perilous. But worst of all was the fact that the flesh of Connacht could grow. It infected any living being, or a semblance of a living being, it could reach, then made them a part of itself. I can't let it touch me. After witnessing the fate of his shell, Sunny felt quite disturbed. He was not at all confident that his body would be able to resist the flesh of Connacht, even if it had been altered by Weaver's lineage. And since it seemed that even manifested shadows could become hosts to the parasitic titan, at least if the form they were manifested into resembled living beings, he could not be sure that abandoning human flesh in favor of his natural form would be of any use, either. How do I kill something that I cannot touch? For now, Sunny chose to continue with his original strategy and attack the shadow of the great titan instead of targeting its body, aiming to destroy the nightmare creature's soul. Neffy's and Sunny clashed with the flesh of Connacht, causing the entire world to ripple and quake. The fury of the forces they unleashed was so terrifying that the palace island started crumbling into the water, while the water itself boiled and seethed in a turbulent chaos of towering waves. The echoes of their terrifying battle washed over the wraiths and the shadows, forcing many to halt. They even reached the Ivory Island, making its chains rattle and the trees growing on its heavenly surface sway. Neffy's unleashed torrents of incinerating flame and rays of annihilating light, burning and severing the body of the great titan. Sunny continued to pursue its shadow, delivering one strike after another. They worked together naturally and seamlessly, without the need to use any words. Not that it did them any good. Cohesion and cooperation were vital in battle, but when the enemy could mutate in any kind of way at any given moment, there were no vulnerabilities left for them to help each other exploit. No matter the timing of their attacks or the direction, the flesh of Connacht could always respond to them with dreadful effectiveness. And even if they did manage to deliver it grievous wounds, those wounds were simply mended without leaving any trace behind. The Great Titan itself, meanwhile, was overwhelmingly powerful, and every one of its terrifying attacks threatened to destroy them. Well, maybe not. Sunny had 7 incarnations, after all, so he would lose a few parts of himself at best if one of the attacks landed. Nephis, meanwhile, could heal herself endlessly. Neither of them even knew if it was possible to kill her, let alone if the flesh of Connacht could. But despite their tenacity, they were at a disadvantage in this battle. Because, unlike the Great Titan, they had something to protect. They needed to protect the Ivory Island, as well as their companions, Jet, Cassie, and Knave. Most of all, Sunny needed to keep the flesh of Connacht away from his last incarnation in Nightwalker, since the process of reuniting his shadow with him could not be interrupted. So, they pushed the Great Titan back into the lake and continued the fight in the shallows. It was then that Nephis finally failed to dodge an attack. The tendrils growing from the immense body of the flesh of Connacht caught her as she was preparing to unleash a conflagration of soul flame. She was a spirit made of light, at the moment, a being made entirely from flame, which made it so there was no flesh for the Titan to infect. However, the tide of red flesh enveloped her, still, and then, something truly disturbing happened. There was no body for the flesh of Connacht to infect and control, so, it created a body. The tendrils of flesh enveloping Nephis slowly assumed a twisted, deformed semblance of her own figure around the radiant spirit, imprisoning her within a cage of bleeding flesh. It was not a mere physical barrier, either. When the flesh of Connacht grew a body for Nephis, that revolting shell actually became her body. And since she possessed a body now, the Titan could infect her. Another terrifying explosion shook the world, and Nephis escaped the body that was forced upon her mind and soul in a whirlwind of flame. She seemed a bit disturbed, though. Nothing is working. Cassie relayed their messages, allowing them to speak with each other. Physical attacks have no effect. It is too big to be turned to ash, and any burns I leave on its body disappear without a trace. Its soul is unimaginably resilient, as well. That was what it felt like to fight a Titan. That being, it seemed endless, inexhaustible, impossible to destroy. Sunny was starting to feel a bit of apprehension. So what the hell do we do? They could even stall for time, really, because the flesh of Connacht was too powerful. Even Death Will was having no effect. Nephis remained silent for a few seconds before relaying the rest of her message to Cassie. I am not sure. We need to keep attacking it, gather information, and then come up with something that will work. If there was something that could work. Sunny gritted his teeth. If only. And at that moment, a familiar voice suddenly resounded in his ears. It was a familiar voice, of course it was. After all, it belonged to Sunny himself. It was the voice of the handy bracelet. It said, "Your shadow has evolved.